Proud father. I got 3 little boys. They're very active, and I really enjoy being a dad. I like watching them. In fact, one day when my youngest son was 3, I remember coming down the stairs, and he didn't see me. He was sitting at the kitchen table playing, and he was sitting there playing with his little cars, and it was super cute. Right? He was having them talk to each other. They're like, hey, let's go get some ice cream. And they drive over and eat ice cream. And they'd be like, let's go get some French fries. Go over and, they were doing this. They were playing. He was playing with the cars. It was so cute. And I had one of those, paternal moments where I just sat back and watched my son and just felt like, oh, he's so great. He lined up his little cars. And then he looked up and he said, if you like this video, please hit subscribe. Please like me on Facebook and leave a comment in the comment section. He said those exact words. He's 3, right? He's 3 years old. There was nobody else in the room, and he didn't have a camera on him or anything. He just thought that's how you stopped playing. Because all the people he had watched on his videos playing with cars, that's what they did. And he's a stinker. I tried to record him doing it because I thought it was so cute, but he refused to. He's like, no, Dad, no. So this moment I was watching this and listening to this, and I was laughing, and I was just thinking about how different his life is from how my life was growing up, and how things are changing. And how it's this weird thing where, on one hand, I am so glad that my older son can now play video games with me that, don't make me want to rip my hair out because they're so boring. We can play real video games, kind of. But at the same time, I miss having them be young. And so it's like this weird conflict inside of me. Oliver, he reminds me of being on book tour for A Memory of Light, right? Oliver's actually named after James Oliver Rigney, which is Robert Jordan's real name. And when I think about that, I'm like, wow, that's already been 5 years, right? He was born 9 days before A Memory of Light came out, which, by the way, I went on tour for. So if you ever meet my wife and you're a Wheel of Time fan, you tell her thank you, because I left for tour 2 weeks after she had a new baby. That wasn't the best timing on any of our parts. Let's just put it there. But yeah, it's like, it's already been 5 years. It's already been like 12 years since I broke in. And it's this weird thing in my brain where I'm like, oh, what happened? All that time, it's gone, right? It's this thing, I think a lot of us, we're talking, there's a lot of discussions in media about it right now, the idea of the place of nostalgia, right, in storytelling. How important is nostalgia? Is it any use to us? Why are we so nostalgic? I'm nostalgic for the days when I was breaking in as a new writer, which is stupid, right? Because those days sucked. When I was breaking in as a writer, what we would do is my friends and I would get together, and we had no money, so we would road trip to a convention, a science fiction convention, where we knew that there were going to be some editors. And we would rent the cheapest hotel we could find and pack 6 of us in this room. And then we would spend the whole convention trying to track down the editors and get them to take our manuscripts, right? This was my life for 5-6 years, was doing this. And it was kind of miserable, in part because the editors, they're good people. They love books. But you can't help but feel like a deer caught in the headlights when you see multiple authors swarming around you, all with their manuscripts, right? By the way, don't ever hand your manuscript to an editor, but, we learned that eventually. You can't help but feel, like you're being swarmed by predators the moment you walk in and say, yes, I'm an editor for sure. Ooh. And so we would go to these conventions. What we actually learned to do, there were 3 of us that went together a lot. Dan Wells, who you might know, he writes horror novels, and Peter Elstrom, who's now my editorial assistant, and myself. And Peter wanted to be an editor. And we learned something cool. We learned if we walked up to these editors and we said, our friend wants to be an editor, they lost that deer in the headlights look, and instead they would put their arm around him and they'd be, oh, you poor, poor, poor boy. Being an editor is the most thankless job ever. The authors don't listen to you. They never do what you say. Oh, it's so terrible. And they would commiserate with him for they just go off for 15 minutes. And then they'd look at us and be like, do you guys want to be editors too? And we'd say, no, we're authors. Here's our manuscripts, right? But they were already trapped in a conversation with us. It worked so well. We came up with a name for it. We called it petering people, right? You can go ask Dan or Peter about this. They will confirm it's true. We petered so many people. It's really weird that I'm nostalgic for those days. I always think about it. I have so many good stories. Because like I said, it was actually kind of terrible. Right? Having to go to conventions, the first time I went to a convention as a published author, it was like some huge burden lifted from me. I'm like, I do not have to come out of this convention with 4 business cards for editors who might be willing to look at my work. I can just go and enjoy people talking about who's the best Star Trek captain, Cisco. That's fighting words, I know. Right? I can it was so nice. And yet, I'm nostalgic. So why are we nostalgic? Well, I'm not sure if I can even answer that, but what is the purpose of nostalgia? I mean, on one hand, one of my favorite philosophers, I was a philosophy minor in school, so that's why I have to deal with some of these speeches, is Heraclitus, right? Heraclitus had this philosophy he talked about. He said, everything flows. You probably heard it encapsulated more kind of in a more common phrase, you can't step in the same river twice. And if you've heard of that, I think there's a song, Pocahontas, right, that talks about that. That was Heraclitus who came up with this idea because a river's always changing, right? It's never the same river because it's always being worn away by the water passing through it. It's different water. Every time you step in a river, it's a different river to an extent. Just a philosophical concept to express this idea that everything changes. And like I said, on one hand, I'm a big fan of this kind of philosophy. By the way, so this does actually relate to prove it. One of the origins of the Stormlight Archive, the book you're now holding, was this kind of concept. The idea of change, and that everything must change, and that change is part of life. When I was building the book, the very first magic system I came up with for the Stormlight Archive was soul casting. For those of you who haven't read it, the ability to kind of change one thing into another, transform. It's like a really fancy form of alchemy, right? And this was the first thing I wanted. In fact, in the original outlines for Way of Kings back in 2001 and 2002, when I was working on it, every Order of Knights Radiant could soul cast. It was just something they all had. You had an ability to change a certain type of material into something else, and you could only use that material, and you could change it. It was going to be there was some really interesting play with that that I really liked about it. But at the end of the day, there was just it didn't end up working. There was too much going on in the match. I want to focus a little bit more rather than have everyone be doing this thing. But that original concept was there because of this idea of transformation being a theme of the Stormlight Archive. And as you read this book, this is where some of these themes really start to manifest. The idea of people transform, people becoming something else. I was going to underpin that with a magic system about transformation, which is still in the books, and is still part of it. That idea was really fascinating to me as part of where the Stormlight Archive came from in the first place. So, I understand that change is important, and yet there's a part of me that's like, maybe if my kids just never grew up, that would be great, because they're just super cute now, and they seem to get a little less cute each year. They're still all cute, but I'm worried. My eldest is 10 years old now, and I've heard tell these teenage years that maybe the cuteness goes away. I don't know. Some parents tell me the cuteness just changes into a different type of cuteness. But there's part of me that's just like, maybe if it would just stop changing, that would be great. But of course, that's a bad idea. In fact, it's a bad idea for lots of different reasons. Heraclitus said that all things come into being through the conflict of opposites, which is another really cool concept if you think about it. The conflict of opposites is what makes new things exist, and I love this idea. It feels like that's there's so many ways to take that, but creativity is like that for me, right? Like my entire career, where do my books come from? There's a conflict between what I've loved in the past and a desire to not be that, both at the same time, right? There's this weird mix of nostalgia versus wanting to be my own person. I grew up reading things like The Wheel of Time, right? And Anne McCaffrey's Dryden Riders of Pern, and these just big, enormous fantasy series. I'm like, I want to do one of those someday, but I don't want to be like them, right? At the same time, that conflict of opposites. We talk about this a lot in writing, this idea that most stories do something where they blend the familiar and the strange. Hollywood loves to do this, by the way. In Hollywood, you'll get those Hollywood pitches. They usually take two familiar things, and it's as strange as the combination of them, right? They'll do something that, like, they'll say, oh yes, this story, it's like Ben-Hur, except it meets the Matrix, right? And you're like, those two things are weird. How do they mix? Well, that's the idea that makes you intrigued, that strange blending with the familiar. And all of my books have come from a place of take something strange and blend it, or something familiar and blend it with something strange. When I was working on Way of Kings for the first time in 2002, I actually went to one of these conventions with my buddies, Dan and Peter. By then, it was really only Dan and Peter and I. Everybody else had fallen out for some reason or another. They realized, I'm a computer programmer, not a novelist. That actually makes money, so I'm just going to go do that, right? So we kind of shrunk down to the three of us going to conventions together. Peter still wanted to be an editor. He'd go on to be an editor at Tokyo Pop, working on manga before I hired him as my editorial assistant. And Dan and I still wanted to be authors. And we went to this con. We were much better by that point. We've been doing this for like 4 or 5 years or something. And we had learned how to stop editors. Dan, in particular, was really good at this. To the point that when he started writing books about serial killers, we were like, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Why haven't you been doing that all along, Dan? For those who knows Dan's work, he started as an epic fantasy writer. That's what his first 2 books he tried to write were. And then he wrote books about, weird people murdering other people, and suddenly he found his place. But we would go to these conventions, and we would find out which editors were new editors who didn't know to run away from us yet, right? We would ask around, who's hungry, who actively wants new authors, who hasn't learned to hide from us. And we got this name, Moshe Fader. And Moshe, he was a newer editor at Tor. He was just been given leave to start acquiring. And so we put Dan on him. And Dan spent the whole convention looking for him and finally found him at a party the last night of the convention. And ran and got Peter and I, pulled us over into this party, and we sat down and we Petered Moshe. And it worked really well. And then Moshe just talked to us for like 2 hours about books and said he would read our manuscripts. Moshe would go on to buy Elantris from me, and I got a serial killer from Dan, publishing both of our first books. So, well, not our first written, but I think for both of us, those were actually our 6th novels. Were the first one sold. So it was a very successful evening. We didn't know it was going to go that well, but we knew we'd found this editor. He clicked with us. He was really excited. So afterward, we decided to go out to dinner, but it was 2 a.m. Not a big deal. It's Montreal. It's like a cosmopolitan city. So we found an Italian joint just down from the hotel that was still serving. We were the only ones in there. It was a little creepy because the guy in the back would just be shouting into the phone the whole time in Italian while we were eating. We don't know who he was shouting at, but he spent the whole time doing that and then came out and took our orders. And this relates too, I promise. And Dan and I made our orders. We were really excited. And you got to know something about our relationship with Peter. Peter kind of puts up with us because we are gregarious author types who are always out there going, books, yeah, and he wanted to just kind of be an editor. He's a little bit quieter. He isn't quite as in your face. And we got there, we ordered our food, and the server was sitting there asking, and he'd been in the back screaming, so Peter's a little intimidated. And the guy said, "What do you want?" And Peter's like, I don't like Italian food. which is just such a Peter thing to do and an us thing to do, to not even really ask Peter where he wanted to go to eat. And the guy's like, well, what do you like? And Peter's like, I like Chinese food. And so this guy's like, well, I'll make you Chinese spaghetti. And he whipped Peter's menu out of his hand and stalked in the back before any of us could complain. And we're like, okay. And then he came out a little later with stir-fried spaghetti. And it was stir-fried. It actually said it was Chinese spaghetti, but it had jajang sauce on it. You want to know their Korean food? That was jajang sauce, which if you haven't eaten, it's like motor oil. That's what it looks like. It's actually really tasty, but it looks like motor oil. So he had dumped this motor oil on it, stir-fried it with some vegetables, and thrown in spaghetti noodles, and then served it to us. And we looked at this, and it just, I mean, it looked terrible. It looked like the grossest thing you've ever seen, right? And yet, you know, it was a celebratory night, and so we tried it. Peter took a bite and was like, guys, this is really good. This is really, really good. And indeed, it was fantastic. It was really, really tasty. We loved it. And it's like one of these things, right? The conflict of opposites. I don't know if Chinese food and Italian food are opposites, but you've got this idea that two disparate things that didn't belong together in our brains actually worked out really well. And this is like the advantage that we have from change, right? This is where we go. We would never have gotten Chinese spaghetti if that server hadn't been willing to change things up. Change is like, it's like in some ways, the fundamental force that makes life possible. Most major world religions have some aspect of change to it, right? Spiritually, whether it's like Buddhist and you're looking inward toward perfection, or whether you're looking toward a savior figure or a Judaic Christian God for perfection, there's this idea that you must become something new, you must change, and if you don't change, that's a bad thing. A lot of fantasy books have this concept of what does the villain want? The villain wants immortality. Lord Voldemort wants immortality. Why is that a bad thing? Because then he never has to change again. He doesn't have to become someone better. He doesn't have to grow. He wants to stay as he is. That's the metaphor for like the whole vampire mythos. That's why it's a dark mythos. It's why Lord Voldemort, not a nice person. This idea that questing for immortality and being a person who never again has to change or grow is a bad thing. Obviously, it's only one subtext of that metaphor, but it's a very religious concept, but it's also a very secular concept, right? The idea that if a species doesn't change, if random mutation didn't exist, that there would be, in some ways, no life, or at least no human life on the planet, right? The idea of natural selection and evolution is based on the concept that change is inherently good, even if small changes sometimes are really terrible, really detrimental. On a whole, if there is no change, then basically nothing could ever be. No consciousness, no people, no higher life at all. And this is like change is so important, and yet we get nostalgic. So what is the purpose of nostalgia? Like I said, I don't know. I don't know if I can answer this in like a 15 minutes worth of Brandon blabbing about random stories in his publishing life. I don't know. But I do know that for me, I've always looked at that first Heraclitus quote, that you can never step in the same river twice. I've always looked at it a little differently. Obviously, I'm not the only person who thinks this way, but I've always thought, the river doesn't change as much day to day as I do. And so if I can never step in the same river twice, it's probably because I have changed more than the river has changed. I can't step in the same river twice because I'm never the same person day to day. And I am becoming something new, and that is scary, right? The reason I look back with nostalgic eyes at what came before is because I've been there. It's not scary. It's the pain and the kind of frustration is the pain and frustration with which I'm familiar, and maybe in the future there are different ones that I don't know about. And if you had gone to me back in those days and said, you will be at Powells sometime, and there's going to be like 700 people standing around, and they're all going to want to read your books, then I would have been like, okay, let's go. Don't be nostalgic for these days, Brandon. And so I feel like I don't know if I have an answer, but I feel like the purpose of looking backward, the reason we do it, maybe should be less about, oh, I wish I lived during those, we could do that again, and more to kind of look at who have I become. Look backward and say, wow, those days were interesting, but look what I have done in that time. Look what I've changed. Look what I've become. Nostalgia can, I think, be useful in as much as it allows you to see how much progress you've made, how much change you've made, and how inspiring those changes and differences can be. And so in some ways, it can be an inspirational, wonderful thing, but like all other tools, we just need to use it correctly. So please hit subscribe, like me on Facebook, do the snap book thing with me, I don't know. Thank you guys very much.